I'm very privileged to be joined today by three people. Yehuda Benin, who is a landscape architect in Kibbutz Shomrat in northern Israel. His brother, Joel Benin, who is emeritus professor of Middle East history at Stanford. And Brandon Kramer, who is the director of the 2025 documentary Holding Liat, which features both Yehuda and Joel and tells the story of the kidnapping of Yehuda and Chaya's daughter, Liat, and the tragic murder of Yehuda and Chaya's son-in-law, Aviv, on October 7th, 2023. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for having us, Peter.
Thank you.
Yehuda, I'm sorry, because you're probably asked this so frequently to relive it, but I just wonder if you can talk about what that day was like for you.
The first thing that happened is that our tenants who live upstairs called Gershon Baskin and asked him what to do. And he said, call the embassy, even though it was, by that time it was Sunday, because we had waited all day Saturday to see what was going on. And basically, by the end of the day, we knew that Liat and Aviv were missing, even though we weren't officially notified by any Israeli force, one way or the other. They said that if you don't know where your relatives are, report to the police, which is basically a useless exercise. On Sunday, our tenant upstairs called Gershon, who suggested that we call the embassy. And I commented that it's Sunday, the embassy is going to be closed. And she said that it may be Sunday, but the embassy is not going to be closed. And sure enough, the embassy was open. So we called the embassy.
This is the U.S. Embassy.
The U.S. Embassy, yes. And later that day, I said, you know what? I'm calling my cousin, who's a former Federation director from Connecticut, and I know that he had political connections, so I called him as well, which is a whole other story. And if we have time to go into it, it's interesting, actually. But in the meantime, as far as the Americans are concerned, by the end of the week, we had been spoken to by the FBI and the State Department. And on Friday the 13th, meaning the families of the American hostages, had an hour and a half Zoom call with President Biden.
Wow. Yehuda, when was the moment that you learned that your daughter Liat had been taken and was in Gaza?
First of all, a lot of details I don't remember. Actually, we see in the movie that we had a discussion with the Army liaison. Basically, the Israeli government was in a very bad way in terms of functionality until the entire reserve mechanism was drafted and got into place. So, for example, our liaison officer was a reserve soldier. It wasn't anybody from the standing army. So that took time. Our official notification, aside from knowing that Liat was missing, came like a week and a half later, was when we had official confirmation. The police were useless in this. They couldn't handle an Excel sheet, to be very frank.
And Brandon, if I can bring you in, as you were trying to make the documentary and capture that experience, what struck you about this experience that, most of us would find, in our worst nightmares of a normal family realizing one day that this horrifying thing has happened? What struck you about that experience and trying to capture it in film?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the narratives that were being shared around the hostages and the hostage families were so heavily reduced and simplified. And what I started observing in Yehuda's family and Joel as well was that every single member of this part of my family were navigating their grief and their politics in very, very different ways. And for Yehuda, that was days after Liat was taken, saying, I need to get my daughter and son-in-law home, but also this needs to be a moment to call for peace and reconciliation, which at that moment in time was a very controversial stance to take publicly amongst the other hostage families. For his grandson, Netta, he was very angry and traumatized. And the idea of reconciliation and coexistence was not something he wanted to hear about. For Yehuda's other daughter, Tal, she didn't want politics to be a part of this at all. Joel was participating in demonstrations calling for a ceasefire. He was speaking alongside bereaved Palestinian family members who had lost loved ones already in Gaza. And so for me, I wanted to tell a story that could understand and empathize with the diversity of experiences emotionally and politically.
Yeah, yeah. Yehuda, all of a sudden you're part of this group of people, hostage families, and in some ways you all have a common interest, but you're drawn from all kinds of different backgrounds and ideological perspectives, and you're being spoken for by other people, and you're trying to... What was that experience like?
First of all, the backgrounds were not that different, actually, in retrospect.
Because they were from the same kibbutzim, generally, it's small
No,
clusters.
no, not necessarily. There are people who could best be described as center left. I think, without exception. There are people who were more from the business community, so they had a different take on how to go about interacting with government people, or in terms of messaging altogether. For example, I came out right away and said, listen, Bibi's running. The situation is this, that in our discussion with Biden laid out his framework for the way Israel should manage this war against Hamas. And to make it perfectly clear, Biden had no issue with destroying Hamas. His issue was with how it was done, and Biden insisted that there be a large flow of humanitarian aid, and that Israel refrain from indiscriminately killing civilians as much as possible. The moment that Netanyahu deviated from that path, it was clear that Netanyahu had other ideas in mind, and that he was going to use this war to achieve goals and aims that were entirely his own, and actually had very little to do with the hostages, had very little to do with the defense of the state of Israel. It was just a tool for him to use in a very Trump-like fashion to advance his own individual agenda. And I came out and I stated this very clearly. Other people in the group were, with the exception of John and Rachel Poland, by the way, and it's in the film, so I don't feel that I have to hide behind that. Were much more circumspect. The hostage family forum altogether was trying to remain apolitical as much as possible, even though it was clear to me that the issue was a political issue from the word go. There are other people who are seen in the film who subsequently apologized to me for not agreeing with me from the get-go. But that's another story. Sometimes being, in your face with politicians is not the best way to advance a cause. This is unfortunately maybe a fault of mine, that I'm much more direct in stating my feelings on that topic. In the end, everyone agreed with me. It was clear that the hostages were going to be released as a result of negotiations, and no military operation was going to achieve that goal, which is, in fact, in the end, that's what happened. There were negotiations, and unfortunately, it took a lunatic like Trump to impinge himself on Bibi to make that come about.
Joel, if I can ask you when you got this news, what it was like for you in the subsequent days, being on the one hand, the uncle of someone who was being held hostage by Hamas and someone who was killed by Hamas, but also being a very eminent historian of Israel-Palestine who has very, very profoundly critical things to say about the nature of the state of Israel.
At one level, this was a magnification and intensification of the previous half century of my life. I mean, this was the first time that someone from my family was physically affected by the various rounds of violence that had been going on in Gaza since 2008, but in other arenas since I left Israel in 1973. So this hit me hard personally as a member of the family. And of course, I was totally united with the rest of my family in wanting to try to get Liat back, and also Aviv. His death was not confirmed until about 12 hours after Liat was released. So at first, the family was thinking that Aviv was also taken hostage. So that was far more intense than anything I had ever experienced at the personal level, although beyond my family, I'm friends with the Peled El-Hanan family that lost a daughter in this Sbarro pizzeria bombing during the Second Intifada. I mean, I know other people who had lost family members, but when it's your own family, it's a whole different thing. And then on the other hand, why do I say it's continuous? Because the critique that I had of Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is one that I developed in collaboration with my Israeli friends when I lived in Israel in the 1970s, and I haven't very much deviated from it. I mean, little nuances and changes as historical circumstances developed, but my critique has been the same since the early 1970s. So that was stable. So then there was this intense balance between I left Israel because I was afraid that something horrible would really happen if Israel continued on the trajectory that it was on in the 1970s. I never, in my worst nightmare, imagined that what happened on October 7th, not only to me and to my family, but to everybody on October 7th would happen. But there it was. And now I had to go out and speak in public about why what happened happened and to call for a ceasefire.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.